The historical costume of Uzbekistan is the clothing worn in the vast Central Asian region in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, up to the middle of the 20th century. And in some regions, they are still worn today. However, the evolution of this clothing has been extremely slow. But first things first. The development of the national costume among the Central Asian nations, including the Uzbeks, was driven by the climate, religion, moral norms, social status, etiquette, and of course, ancient and medieval technologies of textile production. The weaver's craft was one of the most significant crafts in the East. Silk and semi-silk, velvet and cotton fabrics, beautiful in texture and colors, were manufactured practically in all major cities on the territory of the present-day Uzbekistan. They were woven in the ancient cities of Mavrannahr, in Kokand and Andijan, in Namangan and Margilan, in Samarkand and Bukhara, in Nurata and Shahrisabz. By the 19th century, they had become perhaps the most important export to Russia, India, and Kashgar. Abr fabrics have always been the pride of Uzbek culture, as well as folk craftsmen who passed on the secrets of their art from generation to generation. Ustaz Shagird is a living tradition which is still cherished in the multifaceted national art of Uzbekistan. These are unique craftsmen who created fabrics from pure silk. These are Hanatlas fabrics, which are known all over the world today. These are magnificent Adras fabrics. These are natural dyes that were so organically selected. And today, when we see these historical fabrics, we're always surprised how well chosen the colors are and in good taste. And the most important thing is that everything is done with great taste. The caravan routes of the Great Silk Road contributed to the flourishing of trade, intellectual exchange not only in the field of art, but also in the field of crafts and especially clothing. Starting from the end of the 16th century, the territory of Uzbekistan disintegrated into three independent Hanats: the Emirate of Bukhara, the Kokand and Khiva Hanats. Each of these Hanats had an independent economy, agriculture, and developed various crafts. The clothing of each region was highly local and recognizable. Each historical epoch left its mark on the clothes of Central Asian ethnic groups and formed over the centuries. It was the personification of the peculiarities of life and traditions of the peoples. Clothes have always been multi-layered, and there was a reason for that. Great attention was paid to the hygiene of the body and clothing. In general, Islam, as you know, requires cleanliness of the body and cleanliness of clothing, and these hygienic requirements are still reflected in these costumes. The first layer is cotton, and it requires frequent washing. That is, if the first layer is clean, then all the others can be already saved. The second, third layer could already be made of silk, semi-silk fabrics. Here, in all types of clothing, the first layer is made of cotton. Blessed Bukhara. It has always been famous for the development of science, arts, and crafts. A distinctive feature of Bukhara clothing was that it was made of unique silk, semi-silk fabrics, velvet, and brocade. Bakhmal was an elite fabric. In the 19th century, it was made only in Bukhara. The clothes of Bukhara were distinguished by their luxury, first of all. and the clothes of Bukhara were divided into palace clothes, clothes according to the hierarchy that existed at that time in Bukhara and Samarkand. These are very bright and colorful clothes. Local fabrics were used for the manufacture. These are silk, semi-silk fabrics, as well as fabrics brought from Europe, China. This is brocade, this is velvet. But not only were the splendid silks of Bukhara used in the creation of clothes, but also cotton local textiles. Bukhara men's robes were distinguished by the quality of their details. The noble strata of society, the emir and his court, wore clothes with gold embroidery. The uniqueness lies in the fact that here we have magnificent gold embroidery of Bukhara. There is a very detailed ornament, indicating that exquisiteness of the garment was planned initially when making these embroideries. And I must say that during the period of Amir Timur, the palace clothes of the Timurids served as the basis of fashion, and the clothes that were worn there were like an example for other Muslim states. Travelers, ambassadors who visited both Samarkand and Bukhara told that clothes were distinguished by their exquisiteness, taste, and splendor of color combinations. Ruy González de Clavijo, the Spanish ambassador to the court of Amir Timur, superbly described the outfit of Amir Timur himself during the ceremony of meeting the ambassadors in his diaries. Quote verbatim, "The seigneur sat on a small embroidered silk mat and his elbow rested on a large pillow. He was dressed in a plain silk robe and on his head he wore a high white cap with a ruby on top and precious stones." Now, for example, we're working on the creation of the imitation of Bibi Hanum's clothes exactly according to Clavijo, because he described Bibi Hanum's outfit in great details. Like 100 women held the hem of this dress, therefore the headdresses, jewelry, precious stones that were used speaks of how much attention was paid to clothing.
Это говорит о том, что действительно уделялось очень большое внимание одежде, и сам Амир Тимур.
And Amir Timur himself had such an opinion that his court people, his close relatives, wives, daughters, daughters-in-law, sons, Wazirs who visited him, they had to wear exquisite clothes with taste, made of very expensive fabrics. This was the main condition, and very often, when merchants brought fabrics, he himself selected the best ones and distributed them among the female part of his family. When we look at numerous miniatures illustrating the royal plots, we can see that the palace clothes have hardly undergone any changes. These are luxurious robes made of silk and headdresses decorated with sultan aigrettes. For example, alpak is a jacquard fabric. This is also a purely Uzbek fabric. Here are Samarkand clothes. Samarkand and Bukhara clothes were very similar because of their territorial proximity. In different historical periods, Samarkand and Bukhara were almost always united. Take a look at the fabric here. This is a dress. It contains more silk than cotton, but the pattern here is large. Samarkand textiles were distinguished by their very large patterns. The famous historian of that period, Abdurrazak Samarkandi, also described striking details about the unique gold-embroidered ambassadorial gifts that were sent from Amir Timur's empire to the neighboring countries. In his work titled The Place of the Rise of Two Lucky Stars and the Place of the Confluence of Two Seas, We read that during a diplomatic mission to the court of the rulers of Calcutta, the ambassadorial gifts of the king Shahrukh contained headdresses embroidered with gold كالليث اللودزي. Zainuddin Mahmud Wasifi also writes about the art of gold embroidery in his only work, Amazing Events, which is a reliable source for studying the cultural life of Herat and the Timurids. He writes, the art of Zardust, masters of gold embroidery, was valued very highly and competed in exquisite patterns and color combinations with the famous Iranian and Byzantine outfits. The museums of Uzbekistan, as well as the largest museums in Europe and America, have preserved luxurious robes dating from the second half and the end of the 19th century. Magnificent gold-embroidered robes, sewn by Bukhara craftsmen, sent with embassy gifts, were always welcome at the Russian court. Gold embroidery was also an object for collection among numerous travelers who visited Bukhara in the 19th century. Thanks to the German collector Willy Rickmers, the Ethnographic Museum of Berlin has unique gold-embroidered robes and blankets produced in Bukhara. Alexander Burns, an officer of the East India Company of Great Britain, diplomat and collector, one of the founders of the British Museum, who was called Bukhara Burns during his lifetime, described the clothes of the Emir of Bukhara, Bahadur Khan, in his 3-volume edition, Journey to Bukhara. In particular, he writes, Uzbeks love to appear in colorful silk dresses suitable only for the taste of Bukharians. Some of the nobles dress in brocade. The clothes of the Emir of Bukhara, Bahadur Khan, consisted of a simple silk robe made of adras and a white turban with a grid made of feathers and encrusted with diamonds. Indeed, the most impressive were the gold-embroidered robes that belonged to the Emir and his courtiers. The traditions of gold embroidery art, as we have already seen, were laid down in the era of the Timurids and Shaybanids, but they reached their peak in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This type of art, as a rule, was practiced by men who passed down their craft from generation to generation. The best of these craftsmen worked in the court workshops in the Ark. Gold and silver threads were brought from India and Iran, but in the second half of the 19th century, Russia became the main supplier of raw materials. The traditions of gold embroidery art are continued in Bukhara today by hereditary craftsmen. One of them is a master in the 6th generation, Bakhshullah Jumayev. His workshop is always full of tourists and all those who are interested in this beautiful art. The gold-embroidered robes created by Master Jumayev are distinguished by the richness of ornamental solutions, the exquisiteness of performance, and are in no way inferior to the historical samples of gold-embroidered robes. It should be noted that both shoes and accessories were decorated with gold embroidery. Turbans have been extremely popular among the settled male population since the Middle Ages. As a rule, boys began to wear it from the age of 12. Elderly people and old people wore a white turban. The groom's turban was especially colorful. According to ancient belief, the bride herself had to weave and embroider a dark red or red turban for the wedding. And of course, the women's national costume were always distinguished by its particular refinement. This photograph was taken back in the 19th century by the German ethnographer and musician August Eichhorn, who collected a unique collection of Uzbek instruments. In his diaries, he wrote, "The dutar and the rubab were the favorite instruments of Mohammedan women." One can only guess how a German from Saxony could get to İçkeri at that time. Here is the Peshonaband, a headdress. Peshonaband was supplemented with a scarf. Well, of course, it was selected according to color. The ornament that was used in Peshonaband turned into a peshkurta. The peshkurta is a breastplate. And I must say that in general, in the Uzbek national costume, each element had the function of a talisman. That is, peshkurta protects the female reproductive organs. The way of life of settled agricultural population and nomadic tribes were intertwined in the culture of clothing. Not the last role in the formation of traditional Uzbek clothing was played by sharply continental climate. South of Uzbekistan. This is one of the oldest centers of civilization. It was on the territory of ancient Surkhan that the destinies and culture of Achaemenid Iran, the Greco-Bactrian and Kushan kingdoms intertwined, which contributed to the flourishing of architecture, art, and crafts. In the Middle Ages, after the Arab conquest, the interflues area of Amudarya and Sirdarya began to be called Mawaran Nahar, literally country beyond the river. Rare paintings and works of art make it possible to get an idea of the clothes that were worn in antiquity. Traditions in clothing were preserved at a later time. The specific of costumes in Surkhandarya and Kashkadarya were affected by the diverse ethnic composition of the population and the geographical features of the places where they lived, valleys or mountain ranges. In general, the traditional costume of Surkhandarya is bright, airy. It is too bright there, so we see bright colors. And note that silk was almost never used here. Here it's mostly cotton. As for decorations, if we look at the clothes of Khwarezm or Bukhara, there were a lot of decorations, of course, made of gold and semi-precious stones, sometimes made of silver, but practically, even if silver was used, there was just some elements of silver or copper-nickel. The clothing worn in Khwarezm was also distinguished by its originality. Unfortunately, there are no surviving samples of clothes made of brocade in our museums. They used a lot of French brocade, European fabrics, they imported a lot of brocade from China, they used a lot of velvet, and in general, the clothes of the Khwarezmians were distinguished by their wealth and luxury. Jewelry played a huge role in the Khwarezm national costume. From ancient times, there were unique takyatuzi, tumars, where surahs from the Quran were put, multi-layered breast decorations, zulf, and bracelets. They all can be considered real art objects. Khwarezm jewelers created unique, exquisite jewelry, which, starting from the 19th century, were considered precious objects for collection. Each piece of jewelry made by Khwarezm jewelers is unique. For example, temporal pendants bearing the exotic name Yarım Tırnak. As a rule, Khwarezm jewelries, massive in their form, were decorated with gilding on silver and precious and semi-precious stones. You probably know that before, when girls were getting married, they had to have 1 pud of gold jewelry as a dowry. This is 16 kilograms gold, and it was considered both mandatory and quite natural, and did not cause any difficulties because the state was very rich. As for men's clothing, men's robes as a rule were made of striped bekasam, a semi-silk fabric. They were sewn in the traditional way. Cotton fabrics such as boz, alacha, kalami, karbos were also used in sewing men's clothing. Festive clothes were sewn from shoya and benares. The clothes were girdled with both a hand-knitted woolen belt and belts knitted from colored threads with gold and silver plaques sewn on. There were also leather belts, purses, knives, and etc. that were decorated with colored stones. Headdresses are of particular interest. The most traditional of them are skull caps. Surkhandarya skull caps of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were mostly round in shape, reminiscent of traditional yurt. Despite the fact that they were intended for men, they were quite brightly decorated with embroidery. Many of them had a quilted relief surface, which was achieved thanks to the insets, pilta. Skull caps give a complete picture of the various technological methods of embroidery of schools with different traditions, which had their own color and ornamental preferences. The main distinguishing feature of the clothes of the urban population was embroidery made using Iraqi technique. Embroidery gave a special decorative effect and elegance and completely covered the accessories of the costumes, shoes, hats, robes, and belts. Until very recent times, this is how women dressed in Tashkent. And judging only by this outfit, we can say that each time had its own aesthetic ideal, which dictated the choice of fabrics and accessories, because clothing in each area was local, and each epoch left its mark on it. However, clothes have always been the personification of status, emphasizing the modesty and dignity, or the wealth and nobility of the owner's origin. In Tashkent, the traditional forehead decoration was called tillakosh, an ancient wedding adornment made of silver encrusted with multicolored glass as well as corals and pearls. Tillakosh is associated with the image of a bird with spread wings. According to ancient legends, it was the goddess Anahita, the patroness of women and fertility, who turned into a bird. The traditions of the Karakalpak national costume were greatly influenced by the lifestyle of women warriors in this region. The Ustyurt Plateau, with its severe winters and very hot summers. The traditional women's dress, kokkoylek, as a rule was sewn from woolen and half-woolen fabrics, which were richly decorated with yellow and red ornaments. Here, Karakalpak unique clothes were formed due to the harshness of the climate. The attitude towards women who provided continuation of birth was completely unique. Well, almost. It was almost matriarchy. And all these decorations, they had the function of a talisman, absolutely everything. And they were hung on the chest, on the belt area, on the sides, there were earrings, the headdresses were very unique. Saukile. This is the name of the traditional headdress of Karakalpak brides, a prototype of an ancient helmet richly decorated with corals. It was the personification of the mythological ideas about the steppe women. And the headdress testifies to the uniqueness of the objective world of the Karakalpak people. Large bracelets were also the prototype of some armor worn by female warriors in ancient times. All the decorations of the Karakalpaks were heavy and multi-tiered. From the dazzling bright colors of clothes and headdresses to the shimmering reflections of jewelry, all this is the quintessence of the centuries-old traditions of the national costume of Uzbekistan, filled with symbolical meaning from ancient times. Over the centuries, the synthesis of the powerful influence of the ancient heritage and local national art schools, craft traditions, and everyday life have created a system of artistic criteria and canons and clothing filled with deep philosophical meaning, sacred images, and poetic symbols. This is the cultural legacy of Uzbekistan in world collections. Thank you for attention.